Good morning, everybody. I'm now running a small series of talks. This time we're not in the chapel, but in my study during this period of confinement, of lockdown. And this is going to be a very informal kind of talk. Inspired by the interest that many are showing on my blog, notably about the article Tradition and Progress. And then there's a certain amount of interest in what I've written about what I would call the great ecclesiastical freak show. That's to say, from alternative popes like Peter III at Palma de Troya and various others. Things I don't particularly take seriously, but I don't think any of us would admit to taking these things seriously, but they do seem to attract our interest because they are a little bit like the freak shows in Victorian times when people went to see people like the so-called Elephant Man, an unfortunate young man who was suffering from some horrible illness, and he was hauled around England to show him in freak shows. And these things often happen. This is human curiosity, sometimes not very pleasant things. But my subject today is a contrast between sectarian religion with the abdication of reason and the drum I keep banging about the balance between reason and creative imagination. So I'll go a little bit into the question of sectarian religion. Of course, each of us is a sectarian compared with somebody else who's in a more mainstream church. Well, this is one thing we can say is the others are heretics and schismatics, and we are the true believers. And I refuse to go along with this kind of thinking. I think there are other criteria, other ways of thinking that would be more constructive in this reflection. Well, as I've mentioned in other talks and articles, I've had the benefit of a university education at Freiburg University, where the general uh, ethos in the 1980s when I went was on the ressourcement, the notion of return to the sources, patristic theology, the school of theology that you would find among men like Dom Oderkazel, who died just a few years after World War II, Louis Bouillet, Joseph Ratzinger, who is still alive and living in the Vatican, Jean Arny, who is a French author who wrote quite a lot about symbolism and esoteric religion, René Guénon, who is particularly fascinating. I have a few books by him. Three here I would particularly recommend reading. Um, La crise du monde moderne. You probably find a translation of it into English. Another one I have here is le reine de la quantité et les signes des temps. The reign of quantity and the signs of the times. Um, and another one here, Orient et Occident, the Orient, the East and the West, contrasting two mentalities between the East and the West. a theme you will also find in Nicolas Berdyaev, who explored a lot of these themes. So René Guénon has his limits, of course. He was a very interesting sort of fellow, but sometimes drew very interesting conclusions about some of the things he observed. And so I think we have to be careful in what we read. As with anything we read, we need to read critically. We need to be able to think critically and to say, well, anything has value up to an extent, and there may be some things may be more limited than others. So let's come to this theme of little minority groups of believers and their systems of belief. In the history of Roman Catholicism, or simply the Western Church before the Reformation, also within Orthodoxy, there were schisms at various times, caused mainly by the corruption of the clergy, superstition, corruption, neglect, pastoral neglect, siding with the powerful of this earth. The themes are the same nowadays as they always were. And there were a number of sects that arose in the 13th and 14th centuries, mainly associated with the figure of St. Francis of Assisi, and different interpretations. St. Francis of Assisi remained within the system. He might have been a little bit on the edge at times, but he always operated within the limits of papal approval. There were also some Gnostic-based groups like the Cathars, and they were particularly interesting. There's a book I have here by Arthur Guerdon, who was a psychiatrist. I didn't know an awful lot about him. Arthur Guerdon, The Great Heresy. And this is a little study he made of Catharism, its history and its doctrines. I would recommend my readers and listeners to acquire some knowledge about Catharism and how it was persecuted in France by the Inquisition. Many people were sent to be burnt at the stake. It must have been a rather horrible time to go through. And there's the Montségur in France. There are many stories, many conspiracy theories, many things. Subject of Dan Brown novels and things like the Holy Grail and various bits and pieces. And these are things that attract our curiosity. We try to sort of grab onto these things to escape from the humdrum of everyday life. And so we often find with the beginnings of Protestantism in the Lollards and Hussites of the 15th century, and the one common idea was a reaction against clerical corruption and lack of care, lack of anything resembling the Christ of the Gospels. Not all the reactions rejected the sacramental life and the liturgy. In the Orthodox world, we have the Rascal, or the old believers in Russia, who refused the reforms of Tsar Peter the Great and Patriarch Nikon of Moscow between 1652 and 1666. Very interesting. It was a very interesting phenomenon in history. The old believers, they still exist nowadays. For the most part, they've been reconciled with the Patriarchate of Moscow, and they are allowed to use the liturgy that they held on to in the 17th century. Fascinating history. Here in France, there was the Petite Église that split off from the away from mainstream French church because of the concordat between Pius VII and Napoleon Bonaparte in 1801, and some of the bishops refused the alignment of dioceses in France with the département. For example, the department I'm living in here is the Seine-Maritime, but there are no Petite Église people here. They are much further to the south and to the west, towards the Vendée, and around there. There are quite a few where I used to live before my marriage. When I lived in the Vendée, there were quite a few small places of worship of old believers of the Petite Église. And the interesting thing is that they ran out of priests in the 19th century because the bishops refused to or believed it to be wrong to consecrate other bishops. So this little church, they ran out of priests. They became little time capsules of 18th century religion. Very, very interesting. And some of these little communities, they still exist. But they're very, very closed in and not very welcoming of outsiders. A lot of the young people nowadays, they tend to be a little bit like the Amish in America. They tend to be attracted to modern life, and then they go away. They marry. They get jobs, and they become influenced by the by the ambient culture of our times. The Amish, which I just mentioned in America, they came from the Reformed tradition, and quite a lot of films like Witness with Harrison Ford, and that film centered around the Amish in America, and showed the Amish in a very favorable light as very simple but very sincere people, and very coherent in their community life and their philosophy of life. In the early church, around the time of St. Augustine, there were various tendencies like the Donatists, who were very fierce, faced with Christians who had been a little bit fast and loose with Christian formulae, Christian prayers, information about the sacraments and the liturgy, and revealing these things to the Roman persecutors. And the Donatists had a very fixed idea about the validity or invalidity of the sacraments due to these weaknesses or acts of cowardice by Christians faced with persecution. And in some of the sectarian circles nowadays, you'll find elements of Donatism, which was studied by St. Augustine, and St. Augustine wrote quite a lot of polemical work against the Donatists, and you'll find that in any patristics library. Uh, in more recent times in the Roman Catholic Church, of course, there was the traditionalist reaction, mostly led by Archbishop Lefebvre, but also by a number of parish priests and other bishops, and in various countries, and groups of laity. They took great objection to the attempt by Pope Paul VI to abolish the old Roman liturgy and to replace it totally with the liturgy formulated by Archbishop Bourguigny and his committee of the Concilium, consisting of various experts. More recently, of course, 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops, and that caused quite a lot of polemics in the Roman Catholic world. And then, as time went on, the Society of St. Pius X prepared itself for various compromises with Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the present Pope, Pope Francis. They kept the 1962 version of the Roman liturgy. They remained in the scholastic mold for theology and philosophy, and they continued to complain about the question of religious freedom. Now, religious freedom is something that is very profound in our world, in the American Constitution, in the various manifestations here in Europe of Republican movements that came out of anti-clericalism and some very nasty ways of treating the church. And then, for example, here in France, everything settled down again after the First World War, which took the edge off the bouffe curé, the various people of socialist tendencies who hated the clergy and showed it. There were some very nasty tendencies in the 1900s and up to the First World War. Of course, nowadays France is pretty much like America. One can do what one wants within the limits of public order, or within the limits of respecting the vulnerable. France is very sensitive to the question of cults and sects, the way that some people can be influenced into a very irrational paradigm and system of belief. The very interesting thing is about the ironic thing about a lot of Roman Catholic traditionalists is they claim freedom for themselves, but if they had what they wanted, if they had the authority in a country, well, it would probably be something like Spain under Franco, or Chile under Pinochet, and people disappearing and being imprisoned or executed without trial. And such a disregard for human life doesn't seem to be very Christ-like to me and to many others. Then there have been dissidences within the traditionalist world and the Society of St. Pius X. Bishop Richard Williamson in England, with his various conspiracy theories and rather bizarre newsletters he sometimes keeps sending out on the by email to his list of addressees, myself included. I usually open when they come. I usually open Bishop Williamson's messages, and I sort of scan down the page and I think to myself, this man does speak rather a lot of bosh. So the delete button and see what the next one says. Sorry, Your Excellency, but I'm not convinced. Another interesting thing that sprouted out of the traditionalist movement was sedevacantism, um, which is not illogical. That the idea that, for example, a pope, shall we say John the 23rd or Paul the Sixth, and shall we say Paul the Sixth, he approves of the various changes of teaching about, for example, religious freedom, and so all of a sudden it's formal heresy, and a real pope can't teach heresy, so therefore he's not pope. So this is the essential argument of sedevacantism. That's sedevacante, the vacant seat. So so here we find the idea of a church that hasn't had a pope since the death of Pius XII in October 1958. And that leaves an awful lot of problems for those who uphold such a position. The most sedevacantists are not very different, for example, from continuing Anglicans. That's to say, they set up groups of clergy. They have bishops. Most of the bishops come from the Nagudin Tuk succession. Just very, very briefly, Archbishop Pierre-Martin Nagudin Tuk, born at the end of the 19th century, and was a bishop in Vietnam, and became Archbishop of Hue, and apparently was quite distinguished, although sided like his brothers. His brother Nagudin Diem was president of Vietnam, and the whole family was brutally murdered by the Viet Cong, whilst Nagudin Tuk was in Rome for the Second Vatican Council. So for that reason, he escaped being machine gunned or whatever with all the others. There are some interesting books and about Archbishop Nagudin Tuk, but he was the origin of the episcopate and the priesthood in the sect of Palma de Troya in Spain. I won't go into Palma de Troya because it's a very long and complicated subject, and it would need to be treated on its own in isolation. What I can do is I can recommend the studies of a Swedish fellow called Magnus Lundberg, who has extensively studied Palma de Troya, and he can be found on the internet. Just simply suffices to do a Google search for Magnus Lundberg, and if that doesn't isolate the Magnus Lundberg who is relevant to this, you can add other words like Palma de Troya or alternative popes, and he has done some very, very interesting work. So I will leave Palma de Troya there. So sedevacantism, the groups who had bishops and priests, a little bit like us in the Anglican, continuing Anglican churches. Some of the other sedevacantists reacted like the Russian old believers, and the bezpopovtsi, which is a Russian word meaning without priests. The popovtsi, as in the pop, the Orthodox priest, the Orthodox cleric. Popovtsi means with clergy, and bezpopovtsi is without clergy. And we have the same phenomenon in the sedevacantist world. Justifications for ministry, and it's a little bit more complex than we in the continuing Anglican churches. We in the continuing Anglican churches, we have our own diocese, we have our own diocesan structures, and we just simply ignore those of the Canterbury Communion. We just don't bother with them. It's just not our concern. It's much better to do what we think to be right, rather than keep looking over our shoulder at those whom we believe may be wrong in some way. The traditionalist and sedevacantist groups would say we are not allowed to create dioceses because that would be schism against the church. But yet, if there's no pope, what can we do? Either we just say that it's all bunk and become atheist or something like that, or if they believe in it, then they need to come up with some kind of justifying construct. Well, there have been many, and these different theories are very often called positions. So I am of such and such a position, or such and such a position. And then we had, in a kind of almost liberal kind of sedevacantism, Father Louis-Michel Guérard de Laurier, who was a French Dominican, a professor at the Angelicum in Rome, and he formulated a thesis according to which the Pope is materialiter sed non formaliter. He is materially Pope, but not formally Pope. An interesting application of the theory, the Aristotelian theory of hylomorphism. The hyle is matter, hyle, and interestingly enough, the Gnostics talked about hylics. Those humans who are attracted to matter. They are materialists. Hyle. And then morphe in Greek means form. Amorphous, for example, a word we have in English. Amorphous means without form, a piece of indeterminate matter or something without form. So philosophically, one can have matter without form, although it would be difficult to have form without matter. We have the matter and form of the papacy. Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting theory. Gerard de Laurier, Father Gerard de Laurier he was a mathematician. He must have been a very interesting man. There's a priestly institute in the north of Italy, near Turin, the Istituto Marta Consigli, the Institute of Our Lady of Good Counsel. And this institute was founded by priests who'd left the Society of St. Pius X. And I once visited them in about, if I remember rightly, in about 1997. And the one thing that really put me off about them is their dilection for, quite frankly, fascism, Italian fascism. If you scratch the surface, you can find some quite nasty stuff underneath. What Rob Riemann, the Dutch thinker, would call dead rats, an idea I've referred to in my blog. There are some very, very nasty things in the recesses of sinful humanity, and that I found distastefully present in that little institute, which is a great pity, because they celebrate the liturgy, they pray, they seem to be sincere people. And then we go a step further and we find the conclavists. There was a lady called Elizabeth Gerstner, and she was a sedevacantist, and she knew a few priests, and they thought, well, if there's no pope, there are no cardinals either, unless there are maybe a few of the old cardinals from the times of Pius XII. So, is there another way of restoring the papacy? Can the papacy be restored in the hypothesis that it has been lost? Can it be restored? Can it be revived? And some people came up with the idea, well, yes, it doesn't have to be cardinals. It can be whoever's left in the true church, who the true believers can come together and they can elect their own pope. And there were several attempts. The most well known is the most well known are Pope Michael I, Pope Lionus II, Pope Pius XIII, Pope Leo XIV, and Pope Alexander IX. And I'll just say one or two words about each. Pope Michael is a fellow just my age who lives in Kansas, lives with his family, and he called the conclave in about 1990. And he wrote a book, Will the Church Exist in the 21st Century? I can't remember the exact title, but something like that. And he came out with his theories about the possibility of electing a new pope. So only 6 people, including his parents, elected him pope. And so this fellow called David Borden, took the name Pope Michael. You can find him on Facebook. Then there was Pope Linus II, a little bit more enigmatic. A South African called Victor von Pence, and a friend of Elizabeth Gerstner, who lived on the Isle of Wight. And I met him in about 1994 in England. He was living in Hertfordshire, a little bit north of Bishop Stortford. That's right. And but at that time he was no longer pretending. He was no longer claiming to the Pope. Apparently, the conclave took place in Rome. How many were involved? I have no idea. But at the time I met him, he wasn't claiming to be Pope. He was just claiming to be moderator. Whatever he's doing now, if anything, I think he's just in trying to earn a living like everybody else in England, and nothing else really is known. Pope Pius XIII, he was a Franciscan friar called Lucian Pulvermacher, but he died, and named no successor. Pope Leo the XIV and Pope Alexander the Ninth. I think the group is just a spoof, a complete spoof, based in Argentina. There might have been some groups of bishops and priests. Nothing is really clear. The so-called Pope Alexander the Ninth, Alejandro Greco, who was born in 1983 in Buenos Aires, if the person exists. But he was claiming he was making something very big looking on the internet. A complete Vatican with congregations and cardinals, or maybe not cardinals, but bishops with this or that responsibility, and the whole thing is just a joke, just a spoof. So I think we can avoid these red herrings. A little bit like Dan Brown's story about the Holy Grail and how people would go rushing off to this or that. There was a very interesting book written by Umberto Eco, the Italian author who wrote just a minute. Who wrote The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco, and he wrote Foucault's Pendulum. Not sure what the title would be in Italian, but anyway, in English translation, Foucault's Pendulum. And there are all sorts of conspiracy theories that go through the book, coursing through the book like blood through veins and arteries. And it all gets very, very exciting. And then in the end of the book, it all turned out to be just false. That there was no reality. It was just a red herring that distracted us, and that the Umberto Eco's essential message is don't get distracted with all these things, because they're just going nowhere. You just get nowhere without critical thought. We've got more. Life is too short. We've got more important things to think about in life than all these red herrings and conspiracies that really come to absolutely nothing. So this is one of the problems of these things that seem to be that are too good to be true. And I've come to believe in life that if something is too good to be true, it simply isn't true. Though the romantic, creative imagination can make things true, but in a different way, I'm often perplexed about the Die Christenheit oder Europa, written by Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, in 1799, in which he describes a complete parable based on the Middle Ages and how wonderful things were before whatever. And there's a particular interpretation of this parable. It is a parable, and it has to be approached with a different mindset, a different spirituality than simply matter of fact and historical. So there are things that escape our philosophy. And yes, there are more things in heaven and in earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, as Shakespeare once wrote. I belong to the Anglican Catholic Church, one of the main continuing Anglican churches. It's really a pragmatic kind of disposition to keep things going. It's far from ideal. We don't have money, we don't have big churches, with many, many things we don't have. But we do seem to have the essential, or at least we have access to the essential. We participate in the essential. We don't own it. We don't own the truth or the Catholic tradition, but it's a less. It involves less abdication of our reason and intelligence. I'm very, very interested in reading um, things written by Pope Benedict XVI or by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, as he was before being elected Pope. And he wrote particularly about the questions of faith and reason. And as did Pope John Paul II. And this is a particular theme that we will find in our days about this balance between reason, critical thought, escaping what Richard Dawkins, the atheist in England, would call the sickness of mind. Religion, unfortunately, can be a sickness. It can deprive us of reason, and that's a very dangerous thing that comes out of irrational religion. So we have to balance what we believe in what we think. Mysteries of faith, as one of our professors said at Fribourg, mysteries are above reason, not against reason. And there are too many people who are prepared to believe things that are against reason, things that are just patently nonsense. This is a thing about, for example, sedevacantist and its theoretical underpinnings. People are just prepared to believe nonsense. So there is a notion of tradition that has to be tempered by the idea of life, of growth, progress. This is something that came in really with John Henry Newman, with the development of doctrine, and that has been seized on especially by Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, who who coined the term the hermeneutic of continuity. Hermeneutics is, of course, the science of interpretation of anything, of any text, of any thought. Things have to be interpreted. Law, for example, legal texts need to be interpreted to discern the intention of the legislator. So there's a certain space for interpretation. So the science of interpretation is hermeneutics. So interpretation of continuity. Newman came out with the idea that there are some things that are genuine developments and some things that are corruptions. And I think this is a very good way of thinking. There will always be a tension between tradition and life. Tradition, according to, in the minds of most people, tend to be things that are constant, things that are constant references. For example, celebrating Christmas, quite apart from the spiritual and devotional aspect, We celebrate Christmas because everybody does it, because that's the done thing. The Easter, the same thing, because it was plated onto the old the old Passover of the Jews, or even though in the Christian Church there are various methods for calculating the days of Easter for any particular year. There are slight differences whether you go by the moon or by the sun, or well, we go by the moon, the cycles of the moon. The first full moon after the spring equinox is what determines the date of Easter. So these things are traditions and constant references for us. But the idea of organic tradition, growing or developing tradition, and uh, how do we distinguish between true developments and false developments? Well, it's not easy. It just isn't easy, and these things do need to be studied and thought about and discussed. We talk often about coming to compromises. We often call it the via media, as did the 19th century Oxford movement people. The via media between Rome on one side and Protestantism on the other one. In St. Thomas Aquinas, he quoted from Aristotle and wrote the Latin expression in medio stat virtus. The strength stands in the moderate position. So these these things are guiding principles. Um, a lot of the dissident churches of the past, for example, the old believers, have quite happily gone back into communion with Moscow. The Petite Église I mentioned here in France, it's declining because it just it's just something that's remained static, and people can't deal with that anymore. So they go and they marry Roman Catholics and go to the local Roman Catholic parish, or they embrace secularism and consumerism. So I think a lot of these inspirations of a few years ago will end up will just end up assimilated, absorbed into modern life. I think even Palma de Troyes is probably on the way to become a theme park or something to make money, and so a lot of these glitzy things just seem to dissolve and go away. The same thing might happen to continuing Anglicanism too. We only live so long. They teach us to number our days. Each one of us has to be conscious of our own mortality, and a lot of things that seem to matter at one moment, a few years later, have no importance to anybody. But whilst we are still alive, I think we've got to get our minds sorted out a little bit. Between Richard Dawkins' idea of all religion being a sickness of the mind, I would say no, not all religion is a sickness of the mind. Some religion is a sickness of the mind. And he's right about certain things. but not right about everything. And so it is incumbent on each of us to use our critical reason to examine things, to know that nothing is perfectly satisfying, nothing is perfectly coherent. Everything contains some element of incoherence and imperfection, and this is something we just got to accept. And I remember the expression we have in France here, à chacun sa merde. Let each person find his own thing. I won't translate the French word merde. I think probably most of you know what that means. Something rather unpleasant that can hit the fan in certain circumstances. Uh, um, I remember the old saying about the Ouslan bird that flies around in ever decreasing circles until it disappears up its own arsehole. In this safe but somewhat insanitary situation, it showers shit and sarcasm over its pursuer. That's to say, it's its own pursuer. And I think some of us can very easily find ourselves in such a situation. This is human existence, and there are many things that show the way that we can just lock ourselves into our own thing, into our own reality. And I think there are different realities. I think I've come to a much more idealistic notion of metaphysics and epistemology. That's to say, the notion of truth, the notion of being, the notion of existence, the notion everything. It's not entirely objective. It's not entirely separate, distinct from the observing subject. Something my brother came up with in some of our correspondence. My brother, when he was a medical school student, went to India. He went all the way to Kathmandu, as many of our baby boomer generation did in those days, in the early 1970s. Well, he went off to India, and he I think he studied some part of his medical studies there. There must have been something beriberi or dysentery or typhoid or something, perhaps a particular strain of the virus or a virus or a bacterium. I'm not really sure what he studied, but he got a lot of experience about spiritualities. My brother he was never very religious, but he was always very interested in alternative explanations to things, alternative thought, and he probably learned quite a lot of things from Indian ashrams and gurus and things like that. And I've read a little bit about Don Bede Griffiths, who was a Benedictine monk who went off to India and was accused of syncretism, that's to say, the mixing up Christianity and Hinduism. I wouldn't advocate mixing anything up, but I would say that we need to compare things that we would find in the Hindu scriptures, if you can find a translation of them to enable us to read. Any of us who don't read Sanskrit, to be able to read these scriptures, and there are a lot of things in common with the teachings of Christ. And one such idea is non-duality. And it's a thing I haven't really gone into yet, but I would like very much to um, understand what I can. I printed out here from something I found on the internet, so this is not my work, but this is something that perhaps could get us going in a uh, new way of thought, and it's something that the Romantics came up against, just as with the German idealists I mentioned, is the notion of reality, the notion of truth, and the notion of our experience as a perceiving subject or an observer. The entity that I would call me or I, and the entity I would call you, or thee or thou. And what is the difference between you and me? Well, traditional philosophy would call us different persons, even though we share the same human nature. Uh, so, to what extent are we united with each other, and either in terms of nature or in terms of the uh, the most profound uh, notion of our spirit, of our soul. Uh, so normally there should be a unity in everything that exists, with God as the universal being, the universal consciousness in which we all participate. And I think these are ideas that are building in my mind that I don't really have a really very clear understanding, uh, but these things need to be worked on. So this reality, this consciousness, is what Christ calls the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is within you. The parables in the Gospels talk about the kingdom is such is the kingdom of God. The be like a little child, for such is the kingdom of God. So it's a complete it's a completely other way of thinking than the way we are in our nature. Uh, in our nature, we tend to be me and you. So that is a duality. But if there's no duality, I am you and you are me. In what way? So these things need to be thought about. These are things that are much more interesting than thinking about irrational stories about material popes who are not formal popes, or popes who are not popes, or all the various bits and pieces. Again, duality, um, the conflict between ourselves, the conflicts we have with each other, and the idea of non-duality is what there is in common between our own mystics in the Christian tradition, people like Meister Eckhart or um, Richard Roll in England, or various others, um, and the gurus of India. When I say guru, I mean the real gurus of the ashrams, the groups of spiritual adepts in Hinduism. Very often, what we call guru now is any Tom or Dick or Harry who has a bit of an attractive personality, and is able to set up his sect. And often bring people into a very bad situation. But I think this is something. This is an avenue that needs to be pursued. Some names that are mentioned in this article, which is not my work. So this is just a basis on which I need to do my own studies. The Hindus call this non-dual tradition the Advaita. Um, Advaita. Well, I don't really know what that is yet, apart from a tradition in the Hindu scriptures. Uh, and there are various names here. Some of the more familiar would be Meister Eckhart and Uspensky, a Russian thinker who wrote a book called the Tertium Organum, which is the organum of Aristotle. Was a book of epistemology, that's to say the study of truth. So Uspensky's book on the Tertium Organum would similarly be about truth and our understanding of reality, our consciousness. So these things need to be gone into. Consciousness is simultaneously the witness and the substance of all experience, the one reality that gives seeming existence to the mind, body, and world. Oh, this is heady stuff. And whatever happens in our body depends on what happens in our soul, in our consciousness. Enlightenment, deep understanding, no essential difference between me and you and God. Of course, I point upward, but God is not in the sky. We are in God. I'm not a pantheist, but I'm a panentheist. All in God, not all is God, but all in God, which still respects God's divinity and his otherness, because it's a paradox, this unity, but yet otherness. These are things that we do need to work on. If we don't work on them, we just remain in our routines, in our little parishes, as it were. I think we've got to work on new things, even when we're in our 60s and getting on, and plenty of things to do. This confinement, which is where we've been in confinement here in France since the 16th of March, and it's now the 23rd of April, which is St. George's Day. I will be celebrating the Mass of St. George at some time today, and I have various particular intentions. Also, I will be thinking of my country, of my original country, which is England. I have two nationalities now. I'm both British and French. Well, I took on French nationality because I'm permanently living here, which is really the reason. Not so much about questions of Brexit or the European Union, because I have my skepticism about just about all these things. I can see different points of view. Anyway, I'm not going to go into politics, and I'm not going to go into things like this. I'd like to leave you with these thoughts about the role of reason and creative imagination. Imagination that creates and that brings us into God. This notion of non-duality, I think it's something that we do need to pursue, even though it's very, very difficult for us to understand it because it's so outside our habitual way of thinking and feeling. Well, I think I'll leave you there, and I wish you some interesting thoughts. Don't hesitate to leave comments, either here on YouTube or in my blog or on Facebook, and perhaps together, you and I, we can make progress, and I can learn new things and maybe teach things to others. So we teach each other, we learn from each other.